bringing together academics, civil society, and those who are ultimately addressed with these policies, too often their voices lacking, refugees themselves. So we are really glad to have this opportunity to present the results of the project. It's been 4 years and something of work, intensive work across different countries around the world, examining issues which are very similar sometimes across countries. And today the title says it all, assessing EU external cooperation on asylum and migration in light of the Global Compact. Now, the European Union establishes and has dedicated cooperation arrangements and agreements with a number of countries that we have examined in detail, qualitatively, with a number of national researchers in those countries, and also civil society actors, providing us the knowledge on the ground. We have distributed the agenda today, where you have the questions that we will explore. So we hope for a very open and plural conversation, not only presenting the findings, but also hearing from all of you who are sitting around this table. I'm very grateful for every and each of you who are here in person, and also those who are joining us online. I see many colleagues joining us actually online. Some of them will be speaking also online. So thank you to everybody. From my side, really, this is it. The scope is pretty concrete. We hope to complement the debate at the Global Refugee Forum with a more critical account on some policies which are currently being implemented across the world, and Europe is not an exception. Policies that are focused on containing people, making lives of people very difficult, people who are looking for asylum, reframing them as not refugees, real refugees, but as irregular migrants. And this reframing having a deep impact on people's lives and agency, negating both their rights and their agency. This is happening in Europe too. So very clearly in many countries, but also when the EU engages with third countries, the expectations that the EU puts in those countries to contain asylum, to contain people from moving. And so I hope today will be an opportunity for this to go really into detail. Now, I will give immediately the floor to my colleague, Cecilia, representing the Danish Refugee Council. Cecilia, please.
Thank you, Sergio. And thank you all as co-host of this event and as a partner for now almost 4 years of the Thank you, everyone, and for those online as well. As co-host of this event and as partner of the SIL project now for almost 4 years, DSC is also thrilled to welcome everyone here today, online and in the room. Happy to see that everyone managed to find a chair and not to stand up for 2.5 hours. We're happy to welcome you to this important discussion. We are at a critical junction right now where the space for durable solution is shrinking. And we find that discussions around refugee protection is becoming increasingly difficult. At the same time, unfortunately, we are also in the midst of multiple humanitarian crises, and we are seeing severe violations of the rights of refugees around the world. This is coupled with increasing attempts of states to externalize their refugee protection responsibilities. And in light of this, we see the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees perhaps more important than ever. So the compact provides a roadmap for improving this situation. And since its adoption, despite the bleak picture I just painted, we've also seen some positive developments which stress its continued relevance. It's important that we celebrate, of course, the achievement and progress on the commitments of the Global Compact on Refugees. And it's important that we, also the civil society, critical as we may be, also support and back the Global Refugee Forum as a mechanism for mobilizing states, for mobilizing joint multi-stakeholder action. So we need to support and enhance the positive momentum for moving forward the joint commitments of the GCR. And we need to do this, of course, for the benefits of the world's refugees. But it's also critical to look at the actors that engage in this process. And as a major donor, the EU's domestic and foreign policies are, of course, important for the success of the implementation of the GCR. With an estimated 76% of the world's refugees hosted in low and middle income countries, there is definitely a need for significant investment in host countries' capacity to provide protection to people and to deal with the pressure on education systems, healthcare systems, administrative and justice systems, as well as local economies and infrastructures to prevent secondary displacement and empowerment of both of the displaced persons, but also of their host communities. So the EU and its member states are important contributors to the implementation of the GCR and its engagement in forced displacement situations around the world. And as such, it plays a key role in supporting the strengthening of asylum capacity in refugee context. Also in giving prominence to the self-reliance agenda. And all of this is well in line with the commitments of the GCR. But at the same time, as I'm sure we will be celebrating in the coming days, the commitments, engagements, achievements of all the actors engaged, it's also important that we have an honest discussion of the gaps, the shortcomings, and challenges. So we must insist on having a space for critical dialogue and reflection as part of the rollout of the GCR as well. And it's imperative that we address the inaction by states or even the parallel actions by states that are directly counterproductive and undermining the commitments of the GCR towards more equitable responsibility sharing. All actors, state in particular, must accelerate efforts to increase access to durable solutions and more equitable responsibility sharing through expansion of access to third country solution and recognition of global responsibility sharing as a core element of a functioning global asylum systems. So with the continued increase in global displacement, we also see calls for out-of-the-box thinking, proposals for new solutions in the management of displacement, and many such proposals in the European context, also other places, but they relies on strengthening cooperation and partnerships with third countries along the migratory routes. And ultimately, they are also aimed at reducing arrivals of asylum seekers and refugees to EU territory. And we need to be honest about that. The ASIL project, in light of this, brings an important and timely contribution to assessing both the promising practices and the lessons learned of the implementation of the GCR. So through all the comprehensive and comparative research and engagement also with civil society actors like ourselves, the research has exposed and demonstrated some of the harmful effects of extraterritorial asylum cooperation. And not just, it's important to say, as an isolated incident, an unintended consequence of the policies, but rather at times as a systematic characteristics across context and across partner countries. So better solutions to the management of displacement requires international cooperation. It is imperative, however, that we learn from the current approaches, and this is where the project can help us, and not blindly continue policies and practices that undermine rights of refugees and puts at risk the safety of both refugees and migrants. So with this, I look very much forward to a good discussion, a host of excellent speakers that I'm looking forward to hearing, share their experiences. And I really welcome this space during the GRF week for perhaps a critical dialogue on what it takes from all of us, states, other actors, to move forward the commitments of the GCR and to achieve genuine progress on global responsibility sharing.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so
Sergio.
much. Thank you, Cecilia. Of course, we celebrate the positive developments and commitments, and I think your call for our honest discussion and conversation, and how having an evidence-based conversation can inform what we know about the impact of certain policies, and you mentioned how some of those policies co-create irregularity and precarity. as well. So thank you so much for your intro, Cecilia. Now let's move to Shaza Al-Rehawi, Global Refugee-Led Network, please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And I'm really honored to be here today and with the co-organizing for this event. I think it's really crucial. It's on time. We need to figure out what's going on, what works, what's not. So I'm going to discuss the GCR and how these work with the European new pact and all of these things. So for the GCR, actually, GCR is provide a comprehensive framework for international cooperation to address the challenges that forcibly displacement is facing. And it's emphasized on the importance of expanding the protective environment for refugees and the asylum seekers, and to promote international solidarity in this case and for this reception, not detention, to be honest. So the EU has the crucial role to play in implementing the GCR's objectives. It is cooperation with the third countries should focus ensuring all refugees have access to fair and efficient asylum procedures, regardless of their religion, their background, and all of this diversity. We should, as EU, also provide more support for strengthening the asylum process and promote responsibility sharing among countries hosting refugees. In doing so, I think EU should prioritize human rights principles and avoid contradictionally the undetermined access to protection for refugees. It should also learn from promising practices in the EU Migration and Asylum Cooperation Agreement to improve the effectiveness and coherence of its external asylum governance. What we see so far in the impact and the new pact is more protecting the borders than protecting refugees, and we need to stress on this. The priority should be for refugees and for their asylum process in a sufficient way. So as a refugee-led organization, we would like to have some recommendations for the EU role to implementing the GCR. So first, we need to ensure that all refugees have access to fair and efficient asylum procedures. Second, we need to provide and support third countries to strengthen their asylum system. Third, we need to increase the funding for humanitarian assistance, education, employment, and also direct funding and flexible funding for our laws for all these initiatives, local initiatives, and national organization, and all their diversity must be prioritized. Supporting the development of durable solutions, such as a resettlement and voluntary repatriation through the investing in the social compliance to the countries of origin and expanding complementary pathways. And this is not to be reducing from resettlement to have a comprehensive, it's additional to that. Reviewing and adapting existing migration and asylum cooperation agreement to ensure they are fully compatible with the aim of the GCR. And sixth and final, supporting regional cooperation mechanism to promote responsibility sharing and solidarity among countries hosting refugees. National and regional parliaments play a vital role to ensure democratic accountability of the GCR commitments and their implementation. So we should hold governments accountable for their actions and engaging in the civil society and refugee communities to ensure fair human implementation of the GCR. The EU has a responsibility also to cooperate with the third countries to create a major and just equitable system for the protection of refugees. It should work closely with the civil society and also with the refugee communities to ensure that GCR benefits all refugees. We urge EU to take concrete steps to implement this recommendation and strengthen the cooperation with the third countries in a manner that effectively uphold the principle of the GCR, together we can create more human and just world refugee worldwide. So this is our call to put the principle of human rights in the priority of our work instead of protecting borders. And really together we can make it, and nothing about us without us. This is what we are calling for. Including the affected community is the only way, and the key message that I have it here today to share it with everyone. No one can manage to handle everything without talking to the affected community themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is precisely what is lacking. Precisely what is lacking. You know, that's those who are ultimately affected by these policies are put at the center in terms of not only assessing the effect of these policies, but also in the decisions before decisions are made on these policies, that they have a voice represented. And thank you so much for highlighting that the Global Compact on Refugees is also for the European Union. It's not only about something outside the European Union. The European Union has responsibilities as well, and your presentation has highlighted very clearly, very actionable recommendations. So thank you so much for that and your input. This intro provides us with very good basis to move forward with the first panel titled Asylum for Containment, a presentation of research findings and recommendations. We have 3 colleagues in the Asylum Network, and I'm very glad that they've agreed to present their work. They represent a larger group of colleagues in different countries, starting with Professor Thomas Spijkboer, who is a professor at the University of Amsterdam. He's joining us online, and he's been coordinating one part of the work of the project, which has been mainly dedicated to comparative analysis at different countries. And then it will be followed by Gamze Ovacik, Baskent University Ankara, Turkey, and then Meltem İneli Siger, Süleyman Demirel University. So they are going to do a joint presentation, starting with Thomas. Thomas, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see you yet. Now we can see you.
Okay, good.
Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, dear Shaza, Cecilia, and Sergio and others. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you. I have long COVID, and the trip to Geneva would have been too much for me. But I'm happy I can take part online. I will present the general research finding in 10 minutes, and then Gamze Ovacik and Meltem İneli Siger will zoom in on Turkey in 10 minutes. I will share my screen. Let me see. Okay, does this work? Is my screen shared? Can you see my presentation or not? Sergio, Gamze, can you make? Can you? Okay, it's not okay. So then I have to.
We don't see it yet. So.
We cannot see it.
Then I will wait, because then I need some technicians on your side to do this, because on my side it says you are sharing your screen.
Perhaps you can start your presentation while we find a solution with the technicians here. If you can start introducing it.
Sure. I will present the Asylum for Containment report, which has been written by 10 people, whom, if you would have been able to see the presentation, you would see they are listed in alphabetical order. It was really a joint project of researchers in Niger, in Tunisia, in Serbia, and Turkey, and 2 people at the coordinating side in Amsterdam. We chose these 4 countries, Niger, Tunisia, Serbia, and Turkey, because they share one important characteristic, that is that the EU heavily invests in asylum cooperation with these countries, but in any other respect they are very different. If you look at wealth or their relation to the European Union, their geopolitical position, their colonial history, so in any other respect they are different. So that makes for a good and interesting combination. Before going into the subject matter of the research, I want to highlight a methodological issue. The project was developed pre-COVID by 4 white Europeans. And originally, the research design was a classical, let's say, extractivist design. The idea was that a professor would visit each of these 4 countries for 2 weeks and would do standard interviews with 20 locals who were lined up by someone from over there. And then the European researcher would take these interview data and return to Europe and do the analysis. Due to, or maybe we should say thanks to COVID, that became impossible because we couldn't travel. As a result, we had to rely on researchers in these countries. And that changed the character of the research in what we eventually concluded was a very positive manner. Because we had to give these researchers a lot of space to develop the research. For example, in Tunisia, researchers said, yeah, you want to start in 2015. That makes sense from a European perspective. But if you want to understand Tunisia, you have to begin in 2011. In Niger, and these are just 2 examples, national experts said, yeah, it's very nice, your standard methodology, but if you want to understand what's going on here, you need to focus on, you need to give space to the 2015 legislation, which is formally national legislation, but which was a European initiative to implement the human smuggling protocol. So we benefited from the fact that we couldn't use our standard methodology and that we had to rely on the knowledge of these national researchers. In the end, this led to a more profound analysis, in particular because these researchers are acutely aware of issues other than asylum and migration, but national politics. We will run into some examples of that. Also, they don't assume that everything that happens in the field of migration and asylum is a consequence of EU policy. They are aware that there are non-Europe related factors as well. So we think we came up with a better analysis than we could have done if we had implemented the research design as we originally envisioned it, because we had to let go of the Eurocentric setup of the design.
Thomas, thank you. We can already see the PowerPoint.
Okay, that's a relief, because then I can assume that you can see the larger thing. The title of our report is Asylum for Containment, because in one, let's say the elevator pitch would be that our conclusion is that the European Union tries to improve the asylum systems in these 4 countries, which in itself, of course, is a great thing. But there's a but. These 4 countries notice that the European Union wants to do this in order to contain refugees on their territory, and that they don't want. Now, this ambiguity that improving asylum systems in itself great is resisted by these countries because they don't want to become the next, let's say, European hotspot. We think that it's important to notice that it has, and that's our first major conclusion, that it has an important normative aspect. From the European perspective, European policymakers and also European academics notice that 3rd country governments, presidents, prime ministers behave in a very problematic manner, are non-cooperative, slightly erratic, hard to understand, hard to follow. But that's because in our analysis, we, from a European perspective, you don't notice the normative aspect of the position of 3rd countries. To give just one example, Tunisia and Niger are supposed to be willing to contain refugees and migrants on their territory so as to prevent them from moving to the EU. However, there's in an important way, the feeling of policymakers and also of civil society actors and academics in these countries is, listen, in 2011, NATO intervened in Libya and destabilized not only Libya, but also in a major way destabilized North Africa and the Sahel. The human movement that Europe expects us to contain is a direct consequence of that intervention, which backfired in a major way. That's unfair. If Europe makes a mess, Europe should clean up its own mess and should not expect us to do that for them. In other countries, this takes a different. Of course, there's different things at stake because the intervention in Libya is not that important, but it's this kind of normative positions of countries like Tunisia and Niger, but in different ways of Serbia and Turkey, that makes their seemingly erratic and hard to follow behavior much more consistent. So if Europe wants to cooperate with these countries, Europe should understand what the world looks like from their side. And this is just one example. This kind of normative disagreement with the aim of containment makes it very hard for governments in these countries to make cooperation with the EU legitimate. So there's a legitimacy problem for them at the domestic level. This explains why it's so hard for real democracies to cooperate in third countries, to cooperate with the EU, because what the EU wants from them is considered as illegitimate in these countries, and therefore it's most likely that a more or less authoritarian government will be willing to cooperate with this kind of policies because they are less hindered by civil society, the media, let alone parliaments. For example, in Niger, a crucial memorandum of understanding about a crucial memorandum of understanding was kept away from Parliament, was consciously kept away from Parliament because it was unclear whether Parliament would like it. Okay, so that's the first main conclusion. Third countries find the aim of containment illegitimate, and therefore they are none too eager to improve their asylum systems, because if they would do so, it would be easier for the EU to consider them as a safe third country and to contain refugees there. A second conclusion, and then I will wind up. Sergio, I see you. I noticed that you're looking at the time, and it's good that you do that. A second issue that we noticed is that the EU embeds its policy interventions in such wide strings of phenomena that it becomes very hard to apply a normative analysis. Now, this is as I say it in a very vague way. I will give you a concrete example. In Niger, there is the emergency transit mechanism. It's one of the countries, but we focus on Niger. The emergency transit mechanism does it brings people, it evacuates people from the Libyan torture camps to Niger. It then allows them to be in touch with embassies of Europe and Canada to see whether they can be resettled. And then if they are considered refugees and fit for resettlement, they are resettled in Europe and Canada. This is an important initiative that maybe may inspire European governments to imitate it. If you start to analyze this from an international law position and from the perspective of the Global Compact on Refugees, then if you focus exclusively on the resettlement of people from Niger to the global north, so if you you say, well, the core of the ETM is that people are in Niger and then are resettled, then the outcome of that evaluation is outright positive. That's fantastically in accordance with international law and with the Global Compact. However, from a Nigerian perspective, it's great that people are taken out of Niger and resettled elsewhere, but these people have first been transported through the same mechanism from somewhere else, from Libya to Niger. So, and in fact, not everyone who is transported from Libya to Niger is resettled. So a few people, a small number, remain behind, and Niger is stuck with them. It's a small number, but then Niger is a drastically poor country. So even a small number is quite a bit for Niger. If you factor in that the people who are resettled have first been brought to Libya, to Niger from Libya, then from a Nigerian perspective, the evaluation is neutral. Like, it's not good nor bad, because Niger ends up with more or less the same people it had. However, if you then include in the picture that many of the people in these Libyan torture camps, from which the ETM rescues them, have first been pulled back by the Libyan Coast Guard through extensive support of Italy, Malta, Frontex, then you think, well, here's people who were on refugee boats on the Mediterranean. Europe intervenes in such a way that they're brought to Libya, then without any legal supervision, they're brought to Niger, and there again, in a purely discretionary process, they may be resettled. Isn't this what Hirsi Jama, what the European Court of Human Rights prohibited in Hirsi Jama? That this chain of events where people begin on the Mediterranean and then end up in Niger without any legal guarantees. Okay, so here the point we want to make is that the normative evaluation of European policy depends on the frame, on what you include in your analysis, which part of the chain of events you include in your analysis. That
Thomas,
is problematic.
Can you
Yes.
please conclude? Because we are really going over time. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. That's problematic because it leads to normative ambiguity. Now, our policy recommendations, we have 3. We think conditionality backfires, is not a good idea, and we argue that it's better to engage in long-term and comprehensive commitments, in formal instruments and treaties, not all these MOUs and exchange of letters, in multilateral instruments, and in transparent substance and process. Secondly, we think there should be, and it's different from now, operationalized human rights objectives with an ex ante, so a prior human rights audit, and an ex post, so afterwards an impact evaluation on human rights. And finally, if the EU funds research, then third country researchers should play a key role in not only in the implementation, but also in the development of EU-funded projects. And when the EU evaluates proposals on this, the ethics of cooperation should be part of the review procedures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for your excellent presentation. And it is always extremely complicated to synthesize the work of so many years, and you've done it wonderfully. And I think you've been extremely clear regarding the paradox of, or perhaps the raise caution before labeling certain instruments as promising practices. For example, the Niger ETM, when read in combination with all the other instruments that play a role there, there are certainly containment, it's dependent, highly dependent on containment, and it even has some containment in disguise features. So from that perspective, I think the research is very clear in highlighting this, and thank you for the recommendations, also quite clear, quite actionable. Next is Ganse. Ganse, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sergio and Thomas. Building on these general points, I would like to share examples of how they manifest in the context of EU-Turkey cooperation on asylum and migration. We are as of now, we are in the 8th year of implementation of the EU-Turkey statement. So we think it is important to take stock and draw lessons, because these cooperation modalities apparently become a blueprint for other EU third country cooperation arrangements in this field. So I'd like to showcase how the overarching patterns that Thomas summarized, the patterns of non-cooperation and lack of legitimacy, play out in the Turkish context. With their focus on prevention of irregular passages towards Europe and support to Turkey's capacity to host refugee population, EU-Turkey migration cooperation instruments in essence seek to contain migrants and refugees in Turkey and Syria, as pointed out earlier. This containment perspective is problematic because one, Turkey's geographical limitation to the refugee conventions, two, the shortcomings of the Turkish asylum system, and three, the overburden of Turkish capacity for hosting refugees make it difficult for us to assume that Turkey is safe for all asylum seekers and refugees. And in fact, recent judgments of the European Court of Human Rights also confirm this understanding. So against this background, how the two dynamics play out? First, let's talk about pattern of non-cooperation. Turkey's hesitations in cooperating with EU crystallizes in suspension of the implementation of the return component of the statement since 2020. Since then, Turkey stopped readmission of third country nationals from Greece. And this was preceded, in fact, by a declaration by the Turkish President Erdogan in February 2020 to open the country's borders for migrants to cross into Europe, arguing that Turkey could no longer handle the number of refugees fleeing the war in Syria. Turkey's cooperation or suspension of cooperation with EU is, of course, only one of the elements of its much more comprehensive foreign policy. And this is also mirrored in EU policies linking migration management cooperation with non-migration related policy fields as well. So moving on to the second pattern of lack of legitimacy, EU instruments supporting asylum systems in third countries are self-contradictory. How does this play out in Turkey? On one hand, Turkey's adoption of the EU-inspired asylum legislation in 2013 and the ensuing EU support for improvement of the conditions for reception are, generally speaking, positive for protection of refugees in Turkey. But this cooperation progressed in the framework of containment policies. And as of today, this worked. Turkey hosts the largest population of refugees in the world that reached 3.7 million. EU's contribution to the improvement of conditions in Turkey for the sake of containing refugees there, in practice, translated into more individuals to be subject to relatively improved but still problematic conditions. The increased pressure on Turkish asylum system versus the extent of improvement through EU support is an unfair trade-off, we think, for overall refugee protection. So our research underlines this contradiction emerging from the support of asylum system in Turkey and the containment aims in EU policies. This reflects into the lack of legitimacy that EU cooperation with Turkey suffers from. Such lack of legitimacy explains the non-transparent progress and lack of monitoring and accountability mechanisms in the implementation of the EU-Turkey statement. To exemplify, European Commission ceased to publish regular updates on the implementation of the statement since 2017, and EU denies authorship of the EU-Turkey statement, making it into a soft law document. The findings suggest that containment policies that jeopardize the interests of the third countries and refugees they are hosting are neither feasible nor legitimate to address the asylum dynamics. So we say future EU third country migration cooperation arrangements should focus on addressing the root causes of flight and promoting meaningful legal routes instead of adopting containment as sole objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Gamze. Meltem.
Good afternoon, everyone. So building on what Thomas and Gamze presented, I would like to wrap up our presentation by sharing some final thoughts on to what extent EU third country cooperation agreements, in this case EU-Turkey deal, is aligning with the global compact, so the theme of today. I will draw on some examples, of course, like Gamze from the EU-Turkey cooperation, because this is the country we know best and we have done research on in the past 4 years. The EU-Turkey statement, like other similar agreements that of the EU and third countries, focuses mainly on containing refugees and migrants in the countries of origin, like Syria, and in the countries of transit, like Turkey. This approach does not match with the spirit or the objectives of the Global Compact, because Global Compact cites its objectives as easing burden on states like Turkey, which hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, enhancing self-reliance of refugees, and expanding access to third country solutions. So EU-Turkey's statement, for instance, includes a resettlement scheme, what we call one-on-one resettlement scheme, but so far only less than 40,000 Syrians have been resettled since 2016 from Turkey to the all European member states. Considering Turkey at some point hosted, according to UNHCR, 3.7 million Syrians, now the current numbers are around 3.4 million Syrians under temporary protection and nearly more than 4 million forced migrants in total. So compared to more than nearly 4 million forced migrants and Syrians in Turkey, the number of resettled refugees is only just less than 40,000 people. So this is not enhancing third country solutions. This does not really increase legal pathways to the European Union. EU-Turkey statement, moreover, is not all bad. There is a positive component. What we identify as positive and aligning to the Global Compact is the projects funded by the European Union. And these projects concern education, healthcare, socio-economic support to refugees and humanitarian assistance to refugees and host communities in Turkey. So as good practice, we can identify actually the EU-funded projects such as Emergency Social Safety Net, ESSN, Conditional Cash Transfer for Education, CCTE, project on supporting the integration of Syrian kids into the Turkish education system, PICTES, and project for improving the health status of refugee population under temporary protection, SIHAT. So these projects are funded by the EU, implemented by the Turkish counterparts, and of course it also includes Turkish funding as well. These projects, as good examples, have actually made a significant difference in the lives of refugee communities in Turkey. They have helped refugees meet their basic needs, access to essential services like education, healthcare, access to subsistence, and participate in social and economic activities. These projects are the only component of the EU-Turkey statement that actually aligns with the compact, but there is a problem. These projects are not sustainable. Our fieldwork and research shows that most of these projects depend on the EU funding and they do not have a clear exit strategy. If the EU funding stops, these projects will likely to stop as well. These projects are also conditional on Turkey's cooperation in containing refugees and migrants. This means that the EU can use the funding as leverage to pressure Turkey on some certain policy points. This is not a fair way of cooperating with a third country that hosts the largest number of refugees in the world. Therefore, I would like to conclude by saying that the EU and third country cooperation agreements and deals need to work together. Both EU and third countries should need to work together in a more genuine and effective way. The EU should continue supporting refugees and host countries, of course, but this should not be conditional. It should not, and EU should not make the funding conditional on third countries like Turkey to contain more refugees or migrants, or to readmit those who have already risked their lives and went on to Europe. Therefore, we, as Gamze and also Thomas mentioned, we thought that the conditionality of the EU third country agreements should change. And of course, prevention of new arrivals, containment, return components of such deals does not contribute or align with the GCR. Therefore, The EU should, of course, increase its resettlement efforts and offer more legal pathways to align its practice with the GCR. The EU and third countries should cooperate in the spirit of GCR to protect and improve self-reliance of refugees. This is the only way to ensure the dignity and rights of refugees and the host communities and to prevent further lives lost at sea or land. So these are our main conclusions. You can find our reports and 4-year-long research and legal analysis in the Asylum website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melten. Indeed, we have the global portal. We have an asylum global portal where all the research is available, publicly available. You can go to our website, you can click on the country and get all the relevant research by country. We focused on Turkey, but also we have a whole range of countries that are there at everybody's disposal. In terms of what implements or not the Global Compact, clearly our key finding, one of the key findings is we need to be cautious. What implements or not the Global Compact. I remember when we started the asylum project, we heard voices in Brussels saying that the EU-Turkey statement was implementing the Global Compact. Well, now we actually have the evidence showing that this is not entirely the truth, and that we need to look precisely at questions of containment, sustainability of the projects, and how this approach of the European Union to this issue linkage, questions of development, trade linked through migration management, actually have very negative effects on people. So thank you so much to both of you. Now, one of the key objectives of this meeting is to link the academic work with civil society perspectives. We move into the second component of this today's agenda. We have 3 speakers, starting with Syed Hasnain, UNIRE, Italian National Union of Refugees and Exiles. Then we will have Daniela Reale, Global Lead on Children on the Move, Save the Children International. Welcome, Daniela. And then we'll have a colleague online, Chloe Marshall-Denton, Médecins Sans Frontières in Belgium. She will be joining us online. So let's start with Syed. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for also invitation and having the perspective of UNIRE and European Coalition, which is also a refugee-led organization. And also thanks for having GRN as a partner, because I think it is important to consider refugee-led organizations as equal partner. I think next time, even in shaping and also designing new research projects, I think we can have also partnership in this regard. I think it's really helpful. Sorry. And then regarding also the perspective of European Coalition and UNIRE, personally, I have been as a refugee in Pakistan, in Iran, in Turkey. I know very well these countries, and also my arrival by boat in Greece. So based on this lived experience, I can give an overview, and I will be very honest about these policies of European institutions, especially European Commission. So after the deal of 2016 between Europe and Turkey, there has been 500,000 of refugees, people that they were seeking protection in Turkey, they were deported to their country. So we can speak about 2 main important countries. One is Afghanistan, and the second one is Syria. So I think we need to take in consideration in a country that we try to consider that third country a safe country and the country that somehow ensures the human rights of people seeking protection. Unfortunately, this is not the case. This was happening, for example, in Afghanistan when there was still democracy, but it continued, unfortunately, even after the arrival of Taliban. So I think this is really important. As refugees, we are concerned about our fellow refugees in this country, in Turkey, that they are facing direct deportation, unfortunately, and then the narrative we know very well from Turkish authorities that it is voluntary return. This is not the case because they are in detention. They are in a situation that they do not have any alternative. Unfortunately, they do not have any information about legal protection that they can, and this, unfortunately, this deportation somehow is in violation of also Turkish legislations. This is one thing. And bringing here also a very recent and a very fresh data from January till August, around 30,000 Syrian refugees, they have been sent back to Syria. So people that they were trying to arrive to seek protection, to somehow be safe from persecutions, they have been sent in Syria. So this is another concern that really also from our refugee fellows, Syrian refugee fellows, that they are based in Turkey. And maybe my colleague later, Zakira, can mention even further on this regard. Regarding also here, I think last week we have been in European Migration Forum in Brussels. So Commissioner Ylva Johansson said that majority of people arriving, one of the top nationalities that they are trying to arrive in a irregularized way. I call it irregularized because there is not illegal, but because it is made illegal by European policies. She said that we will start cooperation with the Pakistani government, and she has been last year also there to start this somehow discussions on any kind of cooperation. And the approach is to stop the arrival of Pakistani migrants to Europe. And there, unfortunately, recently, we know very well that even Pakistan has become very aggressive towards the rights of asylum for Afghan refugees, especially those people that they've fled Afghanistan after the takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban. Former government officials, soldiers, former soldiers, also many minorities that they were seeking protection in Pakistan, and also journalists, people that they are really could be victim of persecution by Taliban regime. They are seeking protection in Pakistan, and since 1st November till now, 330,000 Afghan refugees, they are somehow obliged and forced to leave the country. And this is also another issue, because when these refugees, they are on external border of Europe, and then when they try to somehow access to European territory, then it becomes somehow a narrative. It becomes a news. But when these countries, neighboring countries, because we know very well that majority of people that they seek asylum from conflicts, big conflicts and wars, they seek protection in neighboring countries. So what is the role of European institutions in cooperating with these countries, and somehow the implication of their policies towards those refugees living in those countries? We know very well, I'm very honest, I have, by restricting the external borders or making inaccessible the European territories, this is not the solution. I have been 8 years in different European countries, in different countries before arriving in Europe. And I knew that there is a danger. I knew that the smugglers are dangerous groups. I knew that it is quite difficult, and I knew that the chances is like 1% and 99% is that you may face many kind of challenges. But those 1% hope was for me something that pushed me that, yeah, you leave, because these countries, for example, Pakistan, Iran, they were not anymore welcoming for me. So this is, I think, the European institutions, European policymakers should understand that if these countries, neighboring countries, there are conflict, they are not somehow livable for refugees or people that they somehow, for example, what happened in Afghanistan, in Pakistan recently towards Afghan refugees, it is for the first time in the history that people ever living there, Afghan refugees born there, because they do not have any access to Pakistani nationality, so they were living as refugee for a long time. They left from one moment to other moment the country, leaving all the business, the life, the family, And it was like a very shocking images that we saw. And unfortunately, there was no news in European countries and newspapers, media. So this is, I think, really important point to take in consideration. And also, I think one last thing is refugees, the toxic narrative around migration is somehow shaping the policies of European Commission and European institutions, but also member states. As I mentioned before, shapes the narrative when we are in trying to access in Europe, and when it concerns the third countries, it is not the case, unfortunately. And this is a big concern for us. I think here again, the role of refugee-led organizations, that they should be in the core, in the center, with partnership with. This is an example. This table, I think, this table affects our life. We should be here, and those policymakers, when they see us, even those far-right groups that they are somehow instrumentalizing, they are making hate campaign on issue of migration. If they see us here, that they once there were people that they were arriving by boat, but today they have they can be on the table and they can bring recommendations and solutions through their lived experience, because they have been through. Because one thing is that you can shape the policies, the procedures. The second thing is that lived experience, that you live, see it from another perspective. So that is really the important. And this is lacking on local level, on national level. I speak about Italy, and European level. I think here is that also the most important thing is that the failure of this policy is that these are designed, these are shaped, these are somehow implemented without a minimum consideration of the views of people that will be affected by this. So this is the failure, not the approach that they have, non-human approach when they try to somehow make these agreements, make these policies. But the main failure comes before, because there is no way, no mechanism to include the view of people with lived experience. So when we will continue to speak about global displacement, now we have more conflicts, the climate change, and etc. So when I arrived in Italy in 2007, the number of displaced people, I think it was from 67 million, and now today we are speaking about more than 110 million people. So if we don't hear and don't listen and don't ask solution to people that they are victim of this forced displacement, and also migrants, people that they somehow try to arrive in Europe for a better future, if we don't hear to their needs and our policies are not based on those needs, then we will continue that next year the number of these displaced people or people trying to arrive in irregularized way will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Let's now move to Daniela.
Thank you. Turn it on. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. It is an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk to you about children and how the external policy are affecting one of the most vulnerable groups amongst migrants and refugee children and their families, many of them moving unaccompanied, some of them moving with members of the families, some of them becoming separated along the route and suffering even more stress and trauma, and becoming even more vulnerable. Today we are looking, we are at the eve of the GRF tomorrow, the Global Refugee Forum, and we are looking a little bit back and a little bit forward, thinking about the Global Compact for Refugee and how this can make a difference for children, for refugee children. And maybe not many people know that there are many provisions within the compact that look at children, that prioritize the best interest of children, that look at access to key services such as education, but also protection, that talk about family reunification, And these provisions are what we are calling for implementation as we move into the kind of the next 4 years of the Global Refugee Forum. And this is where we are really pushing for pledges that talk about child protection, that talk about access to key services, that talk about access to protective education, that really commit to the meaningful participation of children. And by looking at what that means for children that are trying to come into Europe, today we've been hearing from such a range of experts on what are the key kind of cornerstones of the European or European policies. And the first thing that I would say is that what we are actually looking at and seeing across our programs at the policy, but programmatic level and at the research level, is that this increased focus on border control is impacting children, and it's impacting children really, really badly. We've heard how children are stranded in transit countries, particularly, as I was saying, when unaccompanied or separated from the families. And we are seeing from our programs how they are at increased risk of being either recruited by migrants or being subject to violence, by smugglers. Not only that, but also because of this increased focus on border control, they are really facing violence at the hands of border authorities. We carried research a year ago on the experiences of children that were going through the Balkan route, and it was heartbreaking to read. If you haven't seen it, I will definitely circulate a link to it. But each and every child we spoke with had been subject to some forms of abuse or violence across the route. Heartbreaking. This is unacceptable. It's unacceptable from a human rights perspective. It's unacceptable from a policy perspective as well. The consequences of a policy cannot be increased violence against the most vulnerable. And we were talking today about bilateral agreements, and obviously it was mentioned how the Turkey statement has what has meant, and to how it tallies or does not tally with the Global Compact for refugees. But let me tell you that our research also showed that as you looked at the impact of that agreement, whilst there were elements that were positive, obviously, there was an increased rate of depression and attempt to suicide amongst children, which is, again, I can't find another word and say unacceptable, but it's really, really heartbreaking. And if we look at the impact of foreign aid and asylum and migration assistance, which is obviously something that an increase of which we welcome. It has a good impact on children, it has a good impact on development, it has a good impact on people's livelihoods. But when it is linked to securitization, when it's linked to control, when it's linked to conditionalities, then unintended consequences are felt by children. And we are seeing this in Niger, we're seeing this in the route through the Saharan desert, where children are, paradoxically, because of some elements in these policies, being actually kind of shifted towards more dangerous routes. So this is a very quick, but I hope clear kind of outline of what we are seeing as an organization. in terms of the intended and unintended consequences of all these policies and programs. So where do we go from here? You will not be surprised that our first call is that human rights and child rights need to be first, need to be at the heart of these policies, and any policies of financial support need to be assessed for the impact that they have on children's rights. Upholding the no harm principle is fundamental for children. Assessing any counterproductive outcomes of migration cooperation on their protection of refugees and migrants, and also clear measures should be really taken to avoid supporting actors that are involved in violations. A child-specific and child-friendly approach. This means recognizing the unique vulnerability and needs of children and prioritize their protection and the access to services. And a comprehensive and transparent examination of the impact that we're having on children and the families. And this means also providing fundamentally funding that are predictable, long-standing for services that are important to children. I want to give you an example that 20% of the overall needs for refugee responders, only 20% were funded last year. And imagine that only 24% of the required funding for an essential service like child protection was also provided. I mean, this is a major underfunding issue that impacts children immensely. And on the other side, we're seeing a lot of investment on securitization. So some food for thought here. Looking forward, as I was saying, the GRF starts tomorrow. We have 4 children coming from Syria, from Ukraine. We consulted with 430 children across 11 countries. All of them were saying, support us, listen to us, keep us safe, give us an opportunity to learn in a safe environment, and listen to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. So let's now move to Chloe. Chloe, are you there?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I'll be speaking on behalf of MSF, so Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and I'll be basing the next few minutes of my presentation on our operational experience, where we've been present in areas where we have seen the human and humanitarian consequences of these policies play out. So most importantly, on our patients. So as a medical humanitarian organization, we've provided care to people all along migration routes, and our medical teams on the ground have really treated the physical and mental wounds that these measures have inflicted on people. So this has already been echoed in a couple of presentations, but this has translated into forms of containment, into extreme forms of violence and mobilization, which have been either implicitly condoned or indeed sometimes enabled through extraterritorial migration logic. So in the next few minutes, I'll be drawing on our operational experience in Libya, Serbia, Nauru, and Greece, through which I really hope to focus on these wounds, so these physical and mental consequences of such policies. So my first examples are from the cases of Libya and Serbia, where MSF has witnessed the consequences of material, financial, and technical support provided to non-EU states in order to block onward movement. And we've seen the devastating consequences of this across the board. So the most famous example, which was already mentioned today, is with the EU and EU member state support to the Libyan Coast Guard, which, as we know, has only resulted in interceptions at sea and pullbacks at sea to the Libyan coast. Following their interception, people are returned to Libya, which we also know does not meet the criteria of a designated place of safety for the purpose of disembarkation. We also know that people are at risk of being arbitrarily detained in inhumane conditions upon return. Here, MSF has been working in these detention centers, which were also referred to in the first presentation as torture camps. We've seen the patients who we treat, we often treat them as a result of the dangerous conditions in the detention centers. So this includes, for example, tuberculosis, malnutrition, as well as we treat the consequences of very high rates of violence-induced wounds and injuries. We've received repeated reports of sexual and physical abuse among men, women, and children. This is the violence that's happening in detention centers, but as we know, nowhere in Libya is safe. For years already, we've been responding to the precarity, lack of access to care, and violence to which refugees and migrants are also exposed in urban and non-urban areas in the country. Because they are unable to move forward and because they're repeatedly pulled back, they're trapped in cycles of violence with detrimental effects on their well-being. This has also played out to various degrees in other regions, and one that I would like to highlight is the situation in the Balkans, where we have seen another form of this precarity and violence. So in the Balkans, the EU and member states have leveraged the prospect of EU accession in order to incite states, for example Serbia, into adopting increasingly stringent migration management measures. One example of this could be with the 2022 EU Action Plan on the Western Balkans, through which the EU really confirmed, yet again, its priorities on externalized border management and the bolstering of non-EU reception and asylum systems. And since then, also, so since 2022, through our operations in Serbia, we've observed an interesting shift towards a heavily securitized response to people on the move. So here we've seen refugees and migrants being exposed to a cycle of violent evictions and forced relocation, which have been led by Serbian security forces, and through which people have been relocated and forcibly relocated to government-run EU-funded reception centers in the south of the country. So as people move onwards towards the Hungarian border, they're intercepted in the north of the country and pulled back and intercepted to the south of the country, where they're then held in EU-funded reception centers. So this also forces them to restart their journey anew, increasing the precarity of their situation at the same time. We've also seen that these evictions and forced relocations are sometimes accompanied by violence. For example, the MSF mobile teams witnessed a mass eviction that resulted in a child spraining their arm and several others being beaten by law enforcement personnel in the very same location where we were providing humanitarian assistance. Also, as a result of the precarity in which people are trapped, so the medical morbidities that we treat in this context are directly related to poor living conditions to which migrants are exposed, including, for example, skin diseases like scabies and respiratory infections. Meanwhile, I think it's also important to know the mental health consequences of this and the effect that this has on people. So our teams report on the ground that they find people on a daily basis who are in a situation of constant alertness and anxiety out of fear of being exposed to further violence, confiscation of their personal belongings, or out of fear of being forcibly relocated. So this is one type of case of the resources and support with the aim of blocking people's onward journey. But I would also like to raise the example of cases in which people, or where the aim of this cooperation is to transfer people from one country to another. And here I'd like to rely on our operational experience in Nauru in Greece to evidence the devastating impact of these policies. So in 2007 and 2018, MSF provided psychological and psychiatric assistance to people who were sent to Nauru Island under the Australian policy of offshore processing. Under this policy, people who attempted to reach Australia by boat were indefinitely sent to remote Pacific islands, for example, Nauru. And here, MSF witnessed the severe harm and destruction the policy of offshoring and indefinite detention had on people's physical and mental health, as well as their sense of dignity. It's very alarming, but I think important to note that data from this project demonstrates some of the most acute mental health suffering MSF has seen in our 50-year history of providing support to people, including, for example, in cases where we've provided support to survivors of torture. So just to give some examples, we found alarmingly high suicidal ideation and attempts amongst our patients. Out of our 208 patients during that period, 124, so that represents 60%, had suicidal ideation. 30% had attempted suicide. Children as young as 9 were found to have suicidal ideations as well and had self-harmed or attempted suicide. And I think one of the most alarming findings during that period was that 10 children were diagnosed with resignation syndrome, which is a life-threatening psychiatric condition where essentially patients enter into a state of comatose, which requires medical care in order to keep them alive. We also noticed that as time progressed in Nauru, we witnessed the number of suicide attempts increase among asylum seekers. Unfortunately, this is a very predictable consequence of indefinite offshoring when people's sense of hopelessness increases and their well-being declines. And so it's very alarming to have seen some aspects of this policy subsequently mirrored, for example, with the EU-Turkey agreement, but also still being mirrored in other aspects of policy logics today. I won't go into the details of the EU-Turkey agreement because I think it was touched upon. But maybe I can focus more on the Greek side of the EU-Turkey deal. So in order to implement the EU-Turkey deal, the Greek islands essentially turned into sites, large-scale containment sites, in which thousands of men, women, and children were stranded on the Greek islands in overcrowded, unsanitary, unsafe, and degrading conditions, with little access to health services. And here too, we saw that this resulted in a deterioration of their health and their well-being. It also caused widespread misery. And here too, I think unsurprisingly by now, we also documented the severe mental health deterioration among those who were trapped on the island. And we found alarmingly high rates of self-harming, suicidal acts, even among the children. The youngest seen by MSF during that period were 6 years old. And again, as people's sense of hopelessness intensifies, the mental health state worsens. And so while the returns to Turkey have broken down, the logic of containment on the islands remains, and this continues to generate suffering among those who are detained or held in the current close control access centers of Greece. Moreover, I think it's very alarming that the logic of this safe third country and the returns that they're trying to enforce continue to form the foundation of current policies, including policies that are being negotiated at EU level today. And we know based on our experience that this only risks continuing to undermine the health and well-being of people who are arriving to the EU. And so to conclude, drawing on these 4 cases, there are a few points of commonality across these contexts. The first is that across all of these contexts, and indeed across all the migration routes where MSF is present, MSF treats people who have already experienced past trauma and past violence, including in their country of origin and along the migration route. They need and they deserve a safe and dignified conditions on arrival. Second, as a result of these extraterritorial arrangements, people are then further met with either direct physical violence, forms of coercion, as well as structural violence that often compound these existing trauma. They exacerbate existing health issues, as well as result in injuries, as well and long-lasting harm to people. And then third, across all these contexts, the healthcare and assistance afforded to people who are exposed to them have been woefully lacking. And the conditions to which they're exposed prevent healing in safety and dignity. And so, in conclusion, the health, the well-being, and the protection of refugees and migrants must urgently be placed at the core of responses to migration. Of course, it starts by ending all policies and practice that incentivize the use of violence and coercion in all forms, including, I would say, agreements with third countries that have resulted in violence and harm. But going further than that, looking at the interlinked forms of violence that exist today, including the violence to which people are exposed once they actually do reach EU borders, including the widespread practice of pushback at borders, as well as the forms of containment on arrival to which they're exposed. Going one step further as well, I think thinking about protection and human rights as a baseline is hugely important. But if we also view these consequences through the lens of health and well-being, this can help us, I hope, advocate for even more, including advocating for more adapted models of medical care, more adapted models of assistance for individuals in order to allow them finally to heal in safety and in dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chloe.
Yeah.
So we've heard a number of presentations that clearly have provided evidence on the both mental and physical health impacts of these policies. So the evidence is out there. It's very clear, very solid, how the integrity and dignity of people are being jeopardized with these policies. Clear impact on also on specific groups of people. I mean, made me think, because also the reference made to the pullbacks, the pushbacks at the borders raise also elements related to accountability of the authorities who are engaging with this, more rule of law related elements, but this falls within the scope of the Global Compact on Migration. We have this distinction between the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. In the Global Compact on Migration, in fact, there you do have some objectives which specifically target the obligation to conduct border management in full compliance with human rights and the rule of law, and the prohibition of pullbacks and pushbacks because they violate non-refoulement, what we heard before. Clear instances where non-refoulement is at stake, very much at stake. And as we also concluded in ASAL in a previous paper, unsafety as ripple effect. Unsafety as ripple effect of all these policies. Now we have some time. I would like to briefly open the floor before moving to the next speech, either for the colleagues in the panel to react to anything you've heard, or to anyone here, any participant to raise any comment or question before we continue with the final panel on the EU's contribution. So if you have any question or comment, please let me know, raise your hand. For the colleagues who are also online, my colleagues are monitoring, so I will be given some of those reactions. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself. Can you turn your microphone on? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Basma. I do also a research about refugee-led organizations in Turkey, and also I work at British Red Cross in the UK. So I do have two very quick points about that. The first point is responsibility sharing, and actually should be equal and should be informative and should be transparent. So it's not only for the third countries like Turkey or Lebanon. We have the highest refugee per capita in Lebanon, and in Turkey it should be also in the EU and different countries. So we have to take this into consideration when we say responsibility sharing. Second, we really need to change how we look. If we want to do durable solution, we have to stop saying burden. Because if you look at the issue as a burden, you will not really seriously looking at things as a durable solution. And my third point about the EU fund to the UK, the EU fund or the EU agreement to the Turkey. We do have under the EU, you give certain fund for what you call between two brackets harmony, social cohesion, in order to work with refugee-led organizations, refugee communities, and host community. And I really would like here to raise this question and this point very loudly. We need to look about how we build the self-sustainability of refugee communities and host community above unsustainable funding for harmony or social cohesion, and how we really we want to consider the perspective of refugee-led organization and refugee in sustaining, creating, maintaining social cohesion, harmony, or whatever the refugee and host community want to choose the language of their relationship between each other. So you use harmony, we use social cohesion. Refugee communities use another term on the field to describe the relationship. So actually, I would encourage you more to invest in the role of academia and civil society in understanding the EU deal with Turkey, for example, and really to work hard tomorrow or maybe later on to how to change the narrative from burden to responsibility to mutual gain, and how you advocate for informative, transparent, brave, equal responsibility sharing in the EU as well, not only on the third countries like Lebanon, like Turkey, and to take please into consideration the violation of human rights like deportation, forcible deportation of Syrians or Afghani in the countries as well, and even within the EU borders. Don't forget about deportation happening to a lot of people also here as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Before coming to the panel, any other reaction, any other question you may have? The colleagues around the table? Any participants to share their comment, please?
So I represent myself since, and very interesting to listen to all of this today. But since we are talking about the EU, the responses of EU, containments, and the responsibility of the neighboring countries, maybe it would be also good to think about what happened with Ukraine and how the EU has responded to this crisis. I would like to get maybe the point of view of some of the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Any other comment from the colleagues? Otherwise, I come back to the panelists. My colleagues from asylum colleagues, would you like to?
Thank you very much for the comments and questions. So the first one, I use the term burden sharing, and I use interchangeably with solidarity and international responsibility sharing, because I'm not using in any way that refugees are a burden. I have been working on responsibility sharing for many years, nearly a decade now, and we have studied from Alexander Betts that refugees actually contribute to the economic, society, and social structure of host states. But it is undeniable. So my understanding, and when I mentioned that refugees are never burdens, but there is an undeniable fact that mass influx situations, when you have large-scale arrivals of migrants, refugees, any kind of foreigner, irrespective of international protection need, that actually strains the asylum reception and capacity of the host states. And when you have mass influx like to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Jordan, in the case of Syria, or in the case of Ukraine, to Poland, to Germany, you strain the social structures of that country. You kind of test the capacity. That's how we define mass influx. Therefore, when I say mass influx situations, irrespective of who the refugees are, actually introduce burdens on host states. This doesn't mean refugees are a burden, but this kind of situations, like scale arrival of refugees and migrants, actually places burden on host states when the numbers are large. So that was my meaning. And about second point, about the necessity of burden sharing, this is the key actually. And I think GCR's main objective should be to increase the burden sharing, and it was one of the initial objectives. But did we succeed this today at 2022? When you look at the numbers, when you look at implementation reports, you see that responsibility sharing pledges are very inadequate. And especially, although responsibility sharing is key to improve protection, to improve cooperation, we do not see it today. Perhaps we should also discuss the lack of responsibility sharing and perhaps GCR's failure to actually mobilize more burden sharing and responsibility sharing. That would be my main point. Thank you.
expanding on the lack of responsibility sharing or the imbalance, and both on your question and actually Syed's presentation touching upon voluntary returns from Turkey, I would like to give 3 examples. Indeed, the recent European Court of Human Rights judgment on Akkad versus Turkey, this was the issue that was handled. And there was a Syrian national and supposedly, allegedly doing voluntary return to Syria, and then the court found out that it's actually a non-voluntary return, non-informed situation, and the court pointed out, I think that's very important, to Amnesty International's intervention, which documents this is not a single a specific situation, but it is a pattern that is happening in Turkey. And Turkish Constitutional Court also gave a very similar court decision. So we see that this pattern is tackled with by the courts, and it's pointed out by the courts. Another example would be how Turkish implementation moved from open borders to building a wall. So that's also that also shows us how this lack of responsibility sharing is backfiring. And the final point about social cohesion that I could give an example about is the atmosphere of local elections, national elections in Turkey, the recent national elections that happened earlier this year. We saw that both opposition and the government discourse really escalated an anti-refugee sentiment in Turkey, and we see that this whole lack of responsibility sharing is in many ways backfiring in transit countries that are in the position of Turkey. Thanks.
Yeah, on this point, I remember what Syed were saying before, this toxic narrative, how to address toxic narrative when that is institutionalized in the governments, how to address that. There was the question on Ukraine. My colleague Cecilia would like to respond to it.
Yes, or at least I can try. I think it was a good one. And we've heard many examples now on the human rights implications of some of the policies of the EU. And I think many of those relate to the border control, the restriction of movement. And so when you point to Ukraine, that's very important in terms of pointing to an example where there actually were safe pathways for protection and the importance of that. So no doubt there will be a lot of learning and reflection, hopefully, or a lot of potential for learning and reflecting upon how people can reach safety without risking their lives, without having their rights violated, and experience some of the devastating things that colleagues have shared examples on now. So just a short comment on that. Do you want to comment? Yeah, sure.
First of all, I wanted to just say, you have no idea how many letters and ink was used to fight this burden sharing narrative at the time when the GCR was being drafted. We all were there saying, we're talking about responsibility sharing. It's not a burden. Refugees are not burden. We somewhat half won the battle, but only by half, okay? And there is no doubt that when we talk about responsibility sharing, it's also about helping other countries face the pressures that, you're right, experience when a huge influx of refugees arrives suddenly, particularly at the border. There's no doubt about it, but we did try and fight it quite hard. On Ukraine, and I'm not sure how many of you were working on this issue back in 2015, but the difference between that time and when the Ukrainian crisis started and the influx of people started arriving, it was stark. In 2015, there was obviously no freedom of movement. There were children trying to reach parents and families from one place in Europe to the other. It was chaotic. for whatever kind of limitations, and we've seen many, obviously, in a response on the Ukrainian crisis, I think that is the one that really showed that if you allow freedom of movement, managed freedom of movement, that it is just more orderly and much more easily, to protect.
Very
Thank you.
important points. My colleague Melton would like to follow up on this.
So within the project, Asylum project, we have edited a collective volume with Sergio, and the main question was the difference between treatment of Ukrainian refugees and Syrian refugees, also Afghan refugees, or at the time Iraqi refugees. Is it discrimination? Is it just double standards, or is it the discretion of the EU member states in activating the directive? So if you want to have a look, we have more than 500 pages of academic analysis, but our chapters are so short, and it was written like true refugee law experts like Jens here, and we have fantastic discussions on how we can treat this different treatment of member states and the EU for different nationalities of refugees, how it relates to the refugee law, a non-discrimination principle, and human rights. So you can check the website for its open access, and we have shorter chapters as well. So back to you, Sergio.
Thank you, Melton. Jens Vedsted, also an asylum partner. Jens.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on what Cecilia and Melton mentioned, it is really a pity that the EU legislators don't seem to include the experience with the temporary protection of Ukrainians in the ongoing reform discussions. I mean, the adoption of new legislation under the new package is going on right these days, minutes, hours, and everything suggests that they are sort of all influenced, perhaps even heavily, by the kind of perfect storm we have at the moment, with extreme right-wing politicians and governments on the rise, numbers of arrivals on the rise, tragedies on the Mediterranean on the rise, and so on. So I think it's close to a perfect storm. But although the temporary protection and the reception responses to the arrival of millions of Ukrainians were indeed legally debatable in the ways that Melton indicated, it is at least a kind of good practice that could be also included in the overall deliberations. But there seems to be a kind of almost schizophrenic separation of policy agendas here. I have no suggestions how to solve it, but just want to observe it.
Thank you, Jens. I think this is a very timely moment. Then we have to start with the next panel on the EU's contribution. We are joined by member of the European Parliament, Tineke Strick, and I would like to give her the floor. Are you there, Tineke?
Yes, I am, Sergio.
Hello,
Thank you
welcome.
for inviting
We're so
me.
honored. Please, you have the floor.
On this topic, what Jens was just saying, or?
On the EU's contribution, we know that you guys are you've been very much focusing on your work at the European Parliament to ensure accountability of the EU's external policy on migration with, neighboring countries, with transit countries, and you've called for a stronger human rights monitoring and accountability. But also, we understand that at the moment it's a very hectic moment for the Parliament in working in different legislative files on the Migration and Asylum Pact. So in any case, we just look forward to hearing your take on
Okay.
this. Please.
Okay, yes, sorry, I just fall into the panel, so I don't know exactly what your previous discussions were. I just heard Jens say in the minutes and hours that we speak, the pact is being finalized. Maybe something on the process for what we know by now. I mean, there was a lot of pressure already last week, of course, to reach a final agreement, which did not succeed at all because actually all rapporteurs were very much disappointed that the council didn't move an inch on its positions. So that led to the conclusion that we could not find an agreement and that we should go on the 18th of 19th of December. then we will have exactly the same type of negotiations. We will have a full day of trialogues on the separate files. And then we will start at 11:30 in the evening with an open-ended trialogue on all files together. So you can imagine I look very much forward to this event. And yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, if the council sticks to its position, you know, if it doesn't find sufficient flexibility within its mandate, I really hope that then again we will end up inconclusively, because otherwise it would mean that the parliament would give up on the main positions, because the disagreements we have are very fundamental, actually, about mandatory border procedure or not mandatory, mandatory location or not mandatory, screening within the territory or only at the external borders, just to mention a few of them. And also on crisis regulation, it's very clear that the council wants to have as many situations as possible in order to apply the derogations, to have the possibility to apply the derogations. And maybe this is the most dangerous element of the whole pact. So I think in the end, if we look at the council position, we will have a disastrous outcome. But also the parliament position is not, you know, it will not save us from a lot of problems in practice and with the implementation, because simply said, there is not enough safeguard on solidarity. And on the other way, there's a lot of leeway and willingness to allow especially external border countries to derogate from normal standards and also to externalize indeed its asylum policies. I found it striking that immediately after Italy had announced that it would have an agreement with Albania, that the asylum seekers intercepted by Italy would be processed in Albania, that immediately Commissioner Johansson came out and said, we did a provisionally assessment and we found that it's outside the scope of EU law, so therefore it's totally fine for us. And this is actually, you know, almost inviting other member states to also think of these kinds of innovative solutions, and especially because of the emphasis on refusal of entry, the fiction of refusal of entry, it also kind of suggests that you can do things outside the borders as well. So, but you know, everything allowed except for inside the territory. The remark of Jens, I think that's very legitimate. We don't seem to draw any lessons from the Temporary Protection Directive, especially regarding giving sufficient rights to asylum seekers and give them possibilities to integrate immediately, to give them more legal certainty. But I also have to say that the files that we are negotiating on now are not about this element of the asylum acquis. It's really about the border procedure, but and about the procedures as such, and the screening and solidarity. And in that sense, maybe solidarity indeed we could have learned from the Temporary Protection Directive, saying that if we allow for people, you know, to move within this Schengen area and to see where they apply for asylum, this is something that we could have looked at. Does it work with the Temporary Protection Directive or not? But indeed, there's no political willingness at all. We seem to be, you know, to remain very schizophrenic in that sense.
Thank you so much, Tineke, for your feedback, and also you are really there, first line in the negotiations in the parliament, and it's great to know that there are, you know, professionals like you who actually care enormously about both the process and the output in this on these issues. So thank you so much for your presence and your contribution. We've been discussing also a lot in the assessment of the EU external cooperation on asylum and migration, how to let's say, better ensure accountability for human rights? Many of the speakers have highlighted the need to place human rights at the center. And I just wonder, knowing all the work you've done in the European Parliament on this, the Asylum project is calling for ex ante and ex post human rights monitoring of these instruments. What are your views on this matter and the difficulties also in, if there are any difficulties implementing this in your view?
Yeah, I think we can counter only difficulties in that sense. I mean, and I was quite eager when I entered Parliament to get a broad position of the Parliament on this externalization and specifically the human rights dimension, because it's very clear that the Parliament is sidelined and it's not involved, but it's also not so much interested, so it seems. So I thought it's good to wake the institution up and to show, you know, how serious the human rights dimension is of it. And I was very happy in the end. It was not so easy. It was quite tight, but we got a majority for the report that you probably know that we adopted 2.5 years ago. Which actually very clearly called for that. It called for ex-ante human rights impact assessment, for independent, transparent monitoring of the externalization of the cooperation, to have much more transparency on the funding, and also to, you know, to shift the tendency of informalization to formalization. So in order also to restore and protect the institutional balance, not to have these things that Parliament doesn't have a say, but the Court of Justice is also sidelined. So there was an agreement in the Parliament, but then, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because the Commission and Council tend to keep on evading us, our role. And we still don't have a good solution to that, I must say. I mean, we tried, of course, in different ways to ask for human rights impact assessment, to invite the commissioners to the committee, to ask written questions, etc., etc. But it's not sufficient, and that's very clear. And you could say, okay, then we start a legal action because of a failure to act and failure to take into account the fundamental rights. But then again, that depends on a political majority. You need a majority in the Jury Committee to really be able to go to court. So what we try to do time after time is, for instance, try to make it clear in our budgetary proposals that we demand fundamental rights impact assessment and monitoring. But the problem is also with this cooperation is that a lot concerns implementation of projects financed under the NDCI regulation. And there again, I mean, those projects need to also be accompanied with a human rights impact assessment. But the Parliament is then even more on a more distant role, because we don't have a say anymore with there are implementing decisions by the Council. So they don't need to get our approval for adopting these separate projects. So the only thing that I feel now we can do is increasing the political pressure, like we do with Libya, for instance, making very clear, especially after the UN fact-finding mission report, that the funding of the EU actually contributed to the crimes against humanity by the Libyan Coast Guard. And only yesterday we heard from Lighthouse, they revealed, the Lighthouse reports, that Frontex is also sharing coordinates even with militias of Haftar, which have very close cooperation with Wagner. So it's going even further and further. And it seems to be very difficult to hold the Commission and EAS and the Council account to that. So we keep on trying also to demand more transparency. But I must say it's really an uphill battle. It's very difficult because of a lack of legal means, a lack of political willingness, a majority actually in the parliament to, to make it more complicated for the council and the commission. It seems that large groups actually like that the government and their governments and the commission can just go ahead with these types of deals. So that's a very frank, I'm just frank about this because I feel very disappointed. But actually it's not parliamentary worthy, I would say, to accept this. And we need to find ways to be involved ourselves, but more specifically also to get this information about impact of this cooperation, to get it more clear on the table, to make it more transparent. And in that sense, your project and scholarly research and reports of NGOs is really key. In order, not to let them get away with only permissive, declarations of human rights compliance and not do anything in the end with these concerns. And also myself, I was thinking, if the Commission tends to stay reluctant to do proper monitoring, why couldn't we set up our own monitor network, with NGOs, scholars working in the different countries and making sure that we share the information about the impact of the different projects so that it doesn't, that we're not too dependent on actors that have an interest in continuing this cooperation. And maybe one last word, Sergio, because I really also noticed that, and we all know that, of course, it's not only impacting the human rights of migrants and refugees, but also the rights and the rule of law in the countries as a whole. Last week, I talked with an association of judges in Tunisia, and Said is dismissing a lot of judges, and he even announced a new wave of dismissals of judges on important positions, and afterwards they are prosecuted for involvement in terrorism, etc. And now we already have the situation that the Minister of Justice is making its own judicial decisions because the judicial system is completely paralyzed. And I asked them, what do you see of the EU delegation? Is the delegation critical? Do they say anything? Do they go to the judges in hunger strike because of this situation? And they say no. Actually, because they have a too high interest in, in continuing with this migration cooperation with Said. So it's also paralyzing the EU's foreign policy and very severely undermining its coherence as well. So I think we have a lot of interest to really, to break through with this continuous tendency without any self-reflection of, how it works out in practice for human rights, but also for all other types of policies.
Thank you so much. And indeed, this corroborating the finding of asylum that we cannot read separately asylum governance from rule of law, wider rule of law considerations in countries concerned. And in fact, sometimes we better understand the misgivings or the negative impacts if we take this rule of law kind of democracy angle into consideration. So thank you so much, Tineke. Now, you mentioned the role of accountability and democratic control as a way to ensure a state's responsibility and accountability, and not only as regards funds, where money goes, how money is spent, what impacts of that money, but also keep governments accountable. Some of the previous speakers have mentioned that, how to ensure that governments are accountable. So here the role of national parliaments, regional parliaments, interparliamentary diplomacy we raised in the program perhaps needs to be further explored in addition to what already is going on. The Global Compact on Refugees and the Forum provides us an opportunity for that. Now, together with UNHCR, the Asylum Project has been exploring this already with colleagues in Africa, also exploring the role of parliamentarians in Africa, in different African countries. And we want us to explore also more this concept of interparliamentary diplomacy, how this could help in implementing the pledges and the commitments of the governments, or the lack of commitments by some of these governments. Now, we are very delighted to have UNHCR represented in this panel. There was a colleague with whom in the Brussels office that we've been cooperating for a long time, and she couldn't join us due to health reasons. And we are very glad to have Elise Curie-Roberts with us today, very last minute. We are really grateful to have UNHCR represented. UNHCR is a partner of the ASAL project too. So Elise, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sergio, and I'm really pleased to be here. As he just said, I was a bit of a last-minute replacement for my colleague Veronica, and it's been actually really interesting to see the presentations. Obviously, I've known about the work, but I haven't dug in perhaps in as much detail as I could have, and it's provided a lot of appetite to go even further. So I'm just going to say a few words about the EU, particularly in relation to the GRF, but also in relation to the implementation of the Global Compact more broadly in the external. In their external engagement. So just a word, I guess, first in terms of the GRF in particular. Now, we're still eagerly anticipating the EU's commitments and pledges at the GRF. But I think from our perspective, it has been really good to see the increased engagement of the EU in the lead up to the GRF, and we're already anticipating approximately 15 pledges in different areas from the EU. And compared to some of the pledges that we saw in 2019, we are seeing that those pledges will likely be more forward-looking, more concrete, more implementable, and more measurable. So this is actually a positive change from the last GRF. And we anticipate that many of those pledges will have not only financial, technical, but also capacity support included in them. And they'll touch on situation-specific pledges to pledges relating to different thematic areas such as education or data, etc. I think we also really want to emphasize, and this has been touched on by a couple of different speakers, and also your question on the Ukraine response, in terms of, even though we're talking about EU's external engagement, we really can't delink it completely with the internal engagement, because the EU is really, when we're looking at Global Compact, we're talking about responsibility sharing. EU is a big, they host a large number of refugees and displaced persons. They're also a huge donor to both UNHCR, but also to refugee hosting countries. So they play a bit this dual role. And you can't, in terms of looking at the impact of the policy, you can't delink these two roles. And so that's really important to keep in mind. And from the perspective of the EU as a host, the Ukraine situation really springs to mind as a situation where they provided really exemplary leadership in terms of showing how protection can be implemented in response to this rapidly evolving crisis and huge displacement. Providing protection, providing funding to support both refugees and IDPs, and it really demonstrates what is possible. And I think this was touched on in a couple of previous interventions, but this is what we need in terms of leadership when we talk about other situations. And this is where the EU's leadership is particularly important when we're talking about promoting equitable responsibility sharing, especially taking into account that the vast majority of refugees and displaced people live in low and middle income countries. So this leadership role that they've taken internally is really something to be replicated in other contexts. So thinking a little bit about their external engagement in terms of funding, they are, of course, a huge funder of projects in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Americas, and other parts of the world. And in their development funding budget, they do have a 10% goal in terms of targeting the funding to migration and forced displacement over the period of 2021 to 2027. And with this total budget being 80 billion funding, it's a very significant amount of money. And it presents a very clear opportunity for the EU to really link this financing and support provided to ensuring a right-centric approach and policies that promote human rights and protection and inclusion. That being said, when looking at this development funding, it would be important to really ensure that the funding actually reaches refugees and refugee hosting communities. Because of the modalities of reporting, it's very hard to say what amount of money is actually going to which purpose. And so there's very impressive figures announced and discussed, and indeed they are impressive. At the same time, we need to really look at who they're impacting, how they are impacting, and it's a really an opportunity to try to seek more clarity and transparency in terms of what the overall impact of these funds would be. As I think many in the discussion today emphasize the EU's focus on migration partnerships externally. And while there are many opportunities in this, the strong focus on migration and people on the move, and particularly on the move close to the EU, can really detract from recognizing the really important role that countries hosting a large number of refugees close to their point of displacement are playing. And sometimes the emphasis on migration doesn't really give adequate attention to the places where responsibility sharing is very much needed. So I think this is another thing that we can reflect on in the spirit of the Global Compact, is really looking, does this migration focus detract from directing funding or resources to where they're really needed to fulfill the aims of the Global Compact? So in that respect, we would encourage the EU to look beyond migration partnerships and really use their funding, not just looking at through the lens of arrivals in Europe, but recognizing the countries acting as large refugee hosting countries and providing support there, as well as making human rights and protection at the center of the response. So we as UNHCR have increasingly talked about the importance of looking at the whole of someone's displacement journey using a roots-based approach, recognizing the importance of not just looking at country as a country of transit or a country of origin or a country of destination, but really looking at trying to ensure that people who are forcibly displaced have options for protection and solution as early on their displacement journey as possible. We've heard from several of the speakers today some of the horrific impacts of these journeys that can have devastating impacts. I mean, I wanted to say long-term impacts, but that's even understating it. I mean, these are life-changing impacts that they can have. And so really, when looking at external cooperation and development funding, to really try to look at all possibilities for protection, look at all possibilities for solution. And so when we talk about this roots-based approach, we think of several different aspects that need to be there. It's not only strong asylum systems, which are of course key in terms of giving access to protection, but it's addressing immediate protection and assistance needs. It's looking at additional pathways to legal pathways, safe pathways to other countries. It's expanded it's right-centered options for protection. So it's this comprehensive approach that we need to look at to give people options that can prevent dangerous journeys. So I think in terms of looking at the EU's engagement, this is where we would really like to encourage more discussion as to how in the implementation of the pledges, different multi-stakeholder groups can be worked with. We've also heard the importance reiterated here of involving multi-stakeholders and importantly, people with lived experience of displacement in the response, but also but really to encourage a bit of a broader focus on some of the external engagement, really looking at the whole of route, really looking at sometimes looking at routes that are not moving towards Europe, but having this broader perspective. And why this is particularly important is it really is that we're in a global climate where we do find ourselves frequently in discussions that challenge sort of the global asylum regime, and where discussions are increasingly politicized and polarized in many contexts. So in this context, EU leadership is needed more than ever. And if it's perceived that there are double standards or differentiation in terms of treatment of people in need of international protection based on where they are or where they're from, it will be increasingly difficult to have other countries outside the EU partake in this or engage in sort of like more consistent and predictable response to people who are forcibly displaced. So those are a few reflections, but also very much encouraged by some of the anticipated engagement in the global forum, and looking forward to the coming days where hopefully some of these pledges and commitments will be crystallized and give a little bit of new momentum to the aims of the Global Compact, which are worth recalling. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your excellent contribution to today's events. Really, thank you. Your call for EU's leadership, regionally and internationally. They need to be consistent for the EU to be consistent internally and externally, to uphold these principles and to set indeed lead by example in this area. And you also mentioned the importance of monitoring. That was Tineke Strik's also point on the idea to strengthen multi-actor monitoring of what happens on the ground, not only as a way of accountability, but it's also key to legitimacy. So it's not just a question of ensuring accountability, but it's also central to ensure legitimacy of the policies by the governments at stake or by regions like the European Union, to be able to defend, to justify also their choices, the policy choices. So thank you so much. We have now Sakira Hekmat, Afghan Refugee Solidarity Association, and she's also a member of the GRN MENA chapter steering committee. So Sakira, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be here. I want to mention that tomorrow is the second Global Refugee Forum, and as a refugee and internal displaced person, I want to mention that there is nobody that want to be a refugee. And also, refugees do not come to countries empty-handed. They come with their assets and professions. They should be given a chance and opportunity in each country. Maybe in third country, maybe in Europe. And I will speak about the EU contribution to the Global Refugee Forums from the perspective of its migration and asylum partnership with third countries. First of all, maybe enhanced cooperation and coordination is very important. Through this partnership, the EU can contribute to the GRF by sharing best practice, exchanging information and collaboration on joint initiative to improve the protection and assistance provided to refugees. Take this action, maybe countries motivated to do the best for refugees. Capacity building and support. The EU provides support assistance to third countries to enhance their capacity in managing immigration and asylum issue. This support can include financial aid, technical expertise that all of colleagues are mentioned, also training programs for refugee-led organization or for government for receiving and supporting refugees, By building the capacity of third countries, the EU contribution to the GRF's objectives for improving the overall response to the refugee crisis. Most of the money that Europe funds goes to INGO and the government. A very small ones, very small ones that Grand Bargain also said this. This money is transported to local association, especially association that is established by refugees, called refugee-led organization. Maybe more supported in the next year if we will see more supported should go to refugee-led organization, because refugees best knows their response, best knows their problems and how can they solve the challenges. Promoting sustainable solutions. By promoting sustainable solutions, the EU contribution to the GRF's goal of funding long-term and durable solution for refugees that we are expect in this event about long-term impact. It's very important for refugees, children, women, and internally displaced person. Advocacy and policy influence is very important. That we know an agreement was signed by Europe and Turkey in 2016. When every 10 refugees are deported from Greece to Turkey, one Syrian will come to Europe like this. Such agreements lead to discriminations among refugees. Maybe EU countries will think about this because it's very important. And advocacy and policy influence through its migration and asylum partnership. EU can most advocate for the participation of refugees and the respect of their rights in the global level. Because the EU's engagement in the GRF provides an opportunity to raise awareness, share experience, and shape international policies on refugee protection. By actively participating in the GRF, the EU contribution to the development of a more comprehensive and coordinated approach to addressing the challenges of forced displacement. It's very important, although the efforts of European countries and other donors to improve the living condition of refugees are appreciable in around the world. But EU and donor countries should take into account that asylum seekers or refugees of different nationalities are supported fairly in a host country, and especially in the services sector, more attention should be paid. And most of agreements that maybe some of agreements should have positive or negative impact. For example, the negative impact will be risk of human rights violence. Some of the agreements made with third countries may not be compatible with the principle of respecting the human rights of refugees. This can lead to human rights violence such as mistreatment or reputation of refugees. And the second point is justice and equality issues. Agreement made with third countries may create some problems regarding the fair and equal distribution of refugees. During the implementation of this agreement, some refugees may gain access to better conditions, while the other may be disadvantaged. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for your contribution and very clear outline of what you see as key issues to be considered in this conversation. And also, I found very interesting the point that you came back to ensuring equality, justice, and really again, where does this funding go? To have a clear understanding and a strategy to ensure that the objectives are met. And here we come back questions of sustainability, who do we engage in the monitoring and in the assessment to have those people who are firstly addressed having a first role in this. So really thanks so much. Now, we started 15 minutes late. Yes, we started 15 minutes late, and I would not like to close the panel like this. We would like to extend it about 10 minutes or so, so as to allow for some comments and questions based on what we just heard. So it is now the moment for the participants also to contribute. If you have any question, any comment, that's your chance. Otherwise, we have received a comment, one question in written, but before I wanted to give the chance for the colleagues here if they have any comments or questions to the speakers. Yes, please. If you can introduce yourself.
Hi, colleagues. My name is Lauren Farwell, and I'm with UNICEF's Migration and Displacement team. Thank you so much to all of the panelists and all of the participants for your reflections. My question is, thinking ahead to 4 years from now, so that we don't have to have the same conversation with even more such agreements, knowing that even the governments know that these agreements are not cost effective or efficient, right? It's not cheaper to take this route than it would be to meaningfully invest in asylum systems and reception capacity, or expanding legal pathways, or strengthening systems and services in Europe to actually just include and reach migrants and refugees who have arrived. If the approach of appealing to hearts and minds, and I'm looking at where Daniela was sitting, because certainly with UNICEF, we have very similar sentiments and calls to actions. Even when it comes to children, if the hearts and minds approach isn't enough, if there's not real accountability for violations of obligations under international law or for GCR commitments, what can we do really concretely? This is a question really for anyone in the room, to stop the proliferation of these agreements, which unfortunately have become quite standard, as the blueprint has already been created. It seems we pointed several times to it's the toxic narrative and the narrative of overwhelm, kind of inflating the situation to a narrative of overwhelm. That's at the heart of the issue. So maybe what could our organizations do strategically to tackle that toxic narrative? We are all quite solid in our calls to action and making recommendations, but in order that it's not going into thin air, if we need to target towards the narrative, which might be the hardest thing to crack, just wondering if anyone has concrete ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Which I understand also as an invitation for us to really think through beyond this meeting as well, in terms of concrete steps. Please.
My name is Mayam Aslan. I'm from Oxfam. Thank you very much for this very valuable presentation. I think it is very important to see the impact of externalization policies on refugees and host communities as well, and host countries as well. And it is a job very well done. Thank you very much. I think it will be really important to pull some of the different researches done together with this research. I've been based in Turkey for the last 10 years, and together with the Refugee Council of Turkey and the development initiatives, we actually tracked the money in Turkey. And we found out that of the refugee response funds that came to Turkey, 86% were gone through international organizations directly, that is through UN and INGOs and other international organizations. Only 14% was directly gone through the local organizations, that is mostly through the government and mostly to support ESSN project. And only 1% was gone directly to local organizations. And of that, 0.11% was gone to refugee-led organizations. And women's organizations, whether local or refugee-led, were even on the bottom of the line. No. So, and we are planning to track the money again after the earthquake, which sounded like no lessons were learned from that. And I think it is really important to bring these studies together, because it is not only policies negatively impacting the refugees and host communities, but also the resources that are reaching there are not really directly benefiting neither the refugees nor maybe the host communities. And because then you have to calculate that 87%, and where was it spent actually, it's 87%, and how much was it invested in actual programs, and what kind of programs, etc. No, so you can go deeper and deeper in analyzing. So I mean, and that's why I think it is very important to bring these different researches and to really start to think, okay, if this is the system, and if we have externalization, and we have the traditional aid system that excludes the host communities and the host countries and the refugee-led organizations, what are we left with? No? What are we left with in terms of the system, and who's benefiting from the system? No? And who's taking decisions in the system? And the second point I would like to make, I think I really like the UNHCR's invite to not detract attention from the really countries, host countries, and countries that needs the international is responsibility sharing. But in an environment where, for example, if we look to recent General Assembly decisions on call for ceasefires in Gaza, and where 120 countries or more countries has actually voted for a ceasefire, and the international community couldn't actually move to do anything, and the ceasefire couldn't be brought in. What do we really need to do to really activate the multilateral system that is there to protect people, and the state members that are there to protect people, and to really activate the respect for international humanitarian law? What are the mechanisms now in our hands? And this is for refugee response, but also if we want to address the root causes of that displacement, what are we left with? And these are, I think, questions that we really need to address urgently, because we are living in extraordinary times that needs extraordinary thinking, probably by us, civil society, but also by like-minded colleagues in all parts of the system, whether multilateral or regional or national. Thank you very much.
Extremely important points. Very briefly, because we are running to the closing of the panel, please.
Thank you. Unlucky me. My name is Ahmad Wali. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Vrij University of Brussels. And I'm also the president of Umbrella Refugee Committee in Brussels, where we are a refugee-led initiative working together with the UNHCR and Brussels government in welcoming and supporting refugee-led initiatives. I just wanted to comment on a few points here mentioned by some of the speakers, including the previous speaker, about the meaningful refugee participation. This is a very, I believe this is a very important and timely issue that we should talk about and we should discuss, because as a person who have participated in so many events and have been involved in so many discussions on migration issues, I often hear meaningful participation But there is a kind of ambiguity in refugees' meaningful participation or meaningful engagement. For example, so far we have seen that in the last 6-7 years, at least we have now refugees in the panels. We have refugee, I don't know, expert group, advisory board, consultative board, and stuff. But actually, so that's claimed to be refugee participation. But for us, that's not enough. That's not meaningful participation, because you just have that to show that you have someone at the table. While we see big organizations like UNHCR or even the European Commission, they do very little for refugees, and they somehow manage to show it to the whole world that we did something. But then when refugees, when they do a bigger work, much bigger responsibility, they do things that the governments cannot do, but it's not shown to anyone. Like the example that we have in Brussels, it's something that should be worked upon, and this sort of trust should be raised so that bigger organizations, European Commission, European Parliament, should really look at and nurture this, because this is a way that is less costly, is more productive, and in a way it's the experts or the people who had that experience or doing the work. Yeah, and that's how I think it should be really promoted. And one of the reasons that we are here at this forum this time is to conduct research and to study this aspect, that what actually meaningful participation means, how different actors and organizations actually understand meaningful participation or meaningful engagement. And I think for us also that would be very helpful. We have a small questionnaire on maximum 10-15 questions to ask all of you, because for us it's also important to know how people who work on this topic understands meaningful participation. So I'd be really grateful if you also participate in our study, so that in next meeting we share some results with you to see what everybody actually thinks about meaningful participation and how we can understand it. Thank you.
Thank you. We will certainly, fill in that questionnaire, and I think it's a wonderful idea. Thank you for your contribution. Please, Syed, very briefly, please. We need to.
Yeah, just regarding, completely agree with Ahmad Wali, and we have contributed also in the development of the survey together. So it means there is also partnership among refugee-led initiatives, yeah, which is, I think. And just regarding the toxic narrative, I think from perspective of refugees, toxic narrative is directly linked to representation of refugees in the host society. So in Italy, we have a collective of journalists, and they observe the news and media materials in Italian television. And in 2021, the people that they were speaking about migration, they were politicians, journalists, lawyers, TV conductors, anchors, and etc. And only around 7 to 8% were migrants and refugees that they were speaking about, yeah, that material. So they had leadership on that news material. So if we continue to represent refugees, it is also a message to civil society organization. Let us give the refugees and refugee leaders, their organizations, to be self-represented, to self-narrate their story, their needs. Otherwise, it will continue, and especially it creates the image that we have currently, unfortunately. So, then it is also in many cases when we go, for example, in schools, when we meet students, host society students, and when they say that we speak Italian or we can contribute in the society as an active member of host society, the things change completely their perspective. So this, I think, and again here, I think the most toxic narrative is in political debates. So we are like politicians, and before you mentioned that it is institutionalized, this toxic narrative. I think therefore for refugee leaders, refugee initiatives, their communities, it is important to have their space in that political debates. There is the target, because normally we speak about economic inclusion, cultural inclusion, integration of refugees, but we never speak about political inclusion of them, and especially they do not have any say in the political life of our society. Thank you.
I think we've had an amazing exchange and set of presentations and contributions today. We need to move to the closing of this session. If anything, coming back to how to go about this, what we hoped is that, of course, bringing together different communities and people is very important, but the monitoring and the evidence, the information on the ground, what is happening, what is not happening, what is the impact on people, is absolutely central, not only for questions of accountability, monitoring, but also to redirect priorities and to, to reassess, to redirect, to place those who need to be placed at the center, and to re-examine some of the assumptions that lay behind. So with this kind of initiative, we hope to contribute to that conversation, ongoing conversation. Beyond migration partnerships was for me a key message. It is a completely misleading concept. Migration partnership is currently used at the European Union. There's nothing about partnership there, and they forget those who are impacting most directly the choices made by some politicians and policymakers. So, I mean, for today, just to advance that we are hosting the final conference of the Asylum project on the 6th of March next year. It will be online, public also event, where we will be presenting the final results in Brussels and after so many years of work. And for us, this event has been a key milestone in the project. We promised, actually, we were thinking of bringing our results to Geneva, to the background, to the conversation that is taking place around and at the forum, the Global Refugee Forum. We will be there as well in a corner, speaker corner, presenting the findings that we did actually on other countries, on Brazil, South Africa, Jordan, Bangladesh, Canada. So we did actually cover many other dimensions beyond the European Union, and we will be presenting that there. And I just wanted really to thank my colleagues at the DRC for their cooperation, the Global Refugee-led Network, and also my colleague Miriam Mir at CEPS for having, made this possible as well in terms of the logistics and organization. And the closing remarks are by Cecilia. And Cecilia, please.
Thank you very much. And it's not an easy discussion to summarize because so many important points have been raised. And since we're already 15 minutes over time, I think it's a testament to how important the discussion is, or how polite you guys are for staying with us. But I think I just want to raise a couple of points and then maybe get back to your comments on what can we actually do at the end. And fortunately, say just went through the importance of recognizing the roles of refugees, of refugee-led organizations, not just in events like this, global events, but at policy level. So I will skip that point. But to say that while we wait in excitement of EU's pledges that we were also looking for this morning, hoping to read them before, I think what is clear is that that what will be the stakes are too high in terms of everything that's going on at the moment and the displacement situation in the world for it to just to be a celebration of goodwill, display of good intentions without any real impact. And a very, very big task will lie on all of us, civil society, researchers as well, to make sure that human rights implications of the policies are not sort of just something that's known within our community, because it seems so very obvious to us that there are these human rights implications, but it's not necessarily obvious to anyone else. It's not something that's very clear in many places in Europe in the media. So it's something that we need to have strong strategies on. I think it's clear that that when the policies around refugees, when the human costs are not sort of at the forefront, or that we are not as actors that witness it, civil society organizations, refugees themselves, researchers and others, have this knowledge, we need to make sure that that comes across. And I think that the next coming days will be interesting in terms of the commitments that will be there within the 4 outcome areas of the GCR. What I think this research brings is a very needed focus on, as Thomas mentioned, viewing the policies comprehensively. So if we talk about resettlement schemes, have a look at the broader picture. Is that then something that's being used as a bargaining chip in larger corporations for containment? Is it, when we talk about asylum capacity development, is it essentially something that EU countries aim to do in order to be able to use, so to speak, that country as a safe third country in their asylum procedures? So I think the research really brings some important areas of focus for us, for the civil society, for our advocacy, sort of to be pinned on some of these areas. And then for sure, it's a very challenging area. We've talked about the narrative, which is so important. And I think if I just want to point for this research, we know it will end later. We know that all the researchers will continue their research under other projects as well. But so what we would call for as an NGO within this area is that we keep cooperating on making sure that there's evidence to back everything that the civil society witnesses, but that this is together, that researchers and civil society work together to actually bring this to the attention of policymakers. So I think with that, I'll just like to thank everyone again for being here with us, for participating actively, for Sergio to safely guide us through almost 3 hours of discussion, and then just wish you all a very good Global Refugee Forum.